What happens when the man you trust the most, the one who vowed to protect you, is the one who destroys you? This is the terrifying tale of Darnell and Shanice Thompson, where love, addiction, and a devastating secret led to a brutal murder. A story that starts with promise and ends in heartbreak, leaving behind a shattered life and a public spectacle. How does a relationship built on trust and promises fall apart so violently? What happens when a secret becomes too powerful to hide, and the truth shatters everything? In this case, love wasn't enough to shield them from the destruction that followed. A betrayal so deep, a life lost, and a man who, consumed by his demons, would change everything in an instant. Before we dive into this chilling case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more disturbing tales of betrayal, obsession, and violence. Darnell Thompson was a name known in the high-stakes gambling world, a rising star whose charm and calculated moves at the poker tables earned him respect. To his friends, he was the life of the party, always upbeat, always in control. His social media accounts were filled with images of expensive cars, lavish vacations, and celebrations in the spotlight, creating the perfect illusion of success. He quickly became the envy of those who dreamed of the glamorous lifestyle he seemed to effortlessly live. But behind the flashing lights and winning hands, Darnell was struggling with a growing addiction that he kept hidden from the public eye. The gambling that once fueled his sense of power and control had begun to spiral out of his grasp, leading him further into debt. Yet, he continued to put on a smile and pretend everything was fine, determined to protect his image and the facade of a perfect life. Shanice Cross, on the other hand, was a woman who seemed to embody grace and intelligence. She was known for her beauty and ambition, a woman who carried herself with confidence and elegance. But beyond her outward poise, Shanice had dreams of a perfect family, a loving husband, and a life full of happiness and stability. She was deeply dedicated to her marriage to Darnell, always the supportive wife in public, posting photos of their smiling faces, their cozy dinners, their vacations to exotic destinations. To the outside world, it seemed like they were the perfect couple, the epitome of what every relationship should be. But Shanice, too, was hiding a secret. Beneath the glossy surface of their marriage, she was carrying the weight of a financial burden she never expected. To keep up with Darnell's mounting gambling debts, Shanice had resorted to a secret life, one she kept hidden from her husband and everyone who admired her. She had begun working as a high-end escort, a decision that made her feel both trapped and desperate. The guilt of betraying Darnell gnawed at her, yet she justified it as a means to protect the life they had built together. When Darnell and Shanice first met, it was as if they were destined to be together. Their whirlwind romance was the kind of love story that makes people believe in fate. Their dates were extravagant and romantic, nights at exclusive restaurants, lavish gifts, and grand gestures that seemed to transcend the typical courtship. They quickly became inseparable, their chemistry undeniable. Shanice found in Darnell someone who made her feel cherished, someone who made her believe that the love and stability she had always dreamed of were within reach. Darnell, in turn, was captivated by Shanice's intelligence and beauty, drawn to her warmth and the sense of security she offered him, even as his life began to unravel under the pressure of his addiction. Together, they seemed to have it all. Their wedding was nothing short of a spectacle. Friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of the couple, their love story unfolding like something from a fairy tale. The ceremony was grand, and the reception was filled with joy and laughter. It was an event to remember, broadcasted for the world to see on social media, where fans followed their every move. Every post, every snapshot of their life, added to the image of the perfect couple. For the millions who followed their relationship, Darnell and Shanice were the embodiment of love, success, and happiness. They seemed untouchable, a model for others to aspire to. But in reality, the cracks in their relationship had already begun to form. To the public, Darnell and Shanice's bond was unbreakable. Each milestone in their relationship was celebrated with lavish photos, each shared experience amplified on social media for all to admire. Their posts, carefully curated to highlight their love and happiness, became a symbol of perfection. The couple's followers looked to them as an example of what a relationship should be, unaware of the tension brewing behind closed doors. As their followers continued to shower them with admiration, Darnell and Shanice were quietly unraveling. The world saw only the polished version of their lives, their smiles, their glamorous moments, and their love-filled posts, while the darkness that loomed over their relationship remained hidden, unseen by those who admired them from a distance. The pressure to maintain this flawless public image weighed heavily on them both. Darnell's gambling addiction, though kept secret, began to consume him, pushing him into further debt and creating an insurmountable strain on their marriage. Shanice, struggling with the dual life she was leading, felt increasingly isolated, unable to share the truth of her actions or seek help. Their love, once so pure and full of promise, was slowly being suffocated by lies, secrets, and the invisible burdens each of them carried. Still, to the world, they were perfect, until the day the facade began to crumble, and the truth would no longer stay hidden. Behind the scenes, the facade of Darnell and Shanice's perfect life began to unravel. While the world saw Darnell as the charming, successful gambler living a life of luxury, the truth was much darker. Darnell's addiction to gambling, which he had always managed to keep under control, spiraled out of hand. What had once been an exciting rush, a way to escape from the pressures of life, became a consuming obsession. His trips to casinos became more frequent, his bets more reckless, and his losses mounting. With each loss, his desperation grew, and so did the weight of the debts he was accumulating. The public knew nothing of Darnell's hidden struggles. His wins and his carefully curated image kept everyone in the dark about the depths of his addiction. But at home, the toll was becoming impossible to ignore. Shanice, once filled with hope and dreams for their future, watched helplessly as their financial situation grew increasingly dire. She knew that the life they had built together was in jeopardy, but she couldn't find a way to reach him. As Darnell's addiction deepened, so did the strain on their relationship. He became more distant, withdrawn, and irritable. The man she had once trusted with everything seemed lost to his own demons. Shanice's fear grew, fear for their future, fear for their marriage, and fear for Darnell's mental and emotional well-being. It was in the midst of this chaos that Shanice began to make decisions that would haunt her. Desperate to protect the life she had worked so hard to build, she turned to an option she never thought she would consider: high-end escorting. As Darnell's debts mounted, and the pressure to keep their financial situation under control grew unbearable, Shanice made the painful choice to offer her services to wealthy men. She rationalized it as a temporary solution, a necessary evil to ensure their survival. She told herself that it was the only way to keep them afloat. After all, Darnell's addiction had left them with few options. Her new life was a world apart from the one she shared with Darnell. Shanice was careful to keep her double life hidden from her husband, and the weight of that secret became a constant burden on her. Every time she left the house for an errand or a meeting, the guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't help but feel the deep contradiction between the woman she portrayed to Darnell and the one she had become in order to save their future. Despite her best efforts, the stress began to take a toll. Her emotions were in turmoil. She loved Darnell deeply, but the lies were suffocating her. As the days wore on, Shanice grew increasingly isolated. The strain of keeping such a huge secret from the man she loved was overwhelming, and the guilt of betraying him in this way haunted her every waking moment. She knew that if Darnell ever found out, he would never forgive her. The fear of his reaction was paralyzing. Shanice couldn't bring herself to admit the truth. How could she possibly explain to Darnell that the woman he trusted with his life was also the woman who had secretly turned to men for money in order to keep their marriage from falling apart? The burden of silence became unbearable. Shanice often found herself torn between two conflicting emotions: the love she had for Darnell and the guilt of what she was doing to survive. She justified her actions as necessary, even noble, in some twisted way. She was protecting their future, wasn't she? She had to keep the roof over their heads, keep the bills paid, and keep Darnell's addiction from swallowing them whole. But the deeper she sank into this secret life, the more she felt trapped. There was no way out, no way to undo the choices she had made. Her marriage, once a picture of promise and happiness, was slowly disintegrating under the weight of her secret. She began to notice the cracks forming between her and Darnell. He was more distant than ever, lost in his addiction and consumed by his own despair. The love they had once shared seemed to be fading, and the guilt of her own actions only deepened the divide between them. But even as Shanice struggled to keep up the facade, she knew that it couldn't last forever. One day, the truth would come out, one way or another. And when it did, she feared that there would be no coming back from it. The burden of silence had become too much for Shanice to bear. She loved Darnell with all her heart, but the man she had married was slipping away from her, and she was forced to navigate a life that was not hers, one filled with lies, guilt, and growing fear. As her secret life spiraled out of control, Shanice began to question how much longer she could keep up the illusion of their perfect marriage. Would the truth ever set them free, or would it destroy everything they had left? The weight of Shanice's secret had become too much to bear. As the cracks in their marriage deepened, the guilt and anxiety gnawed at her every day. She could no longer hide the truth, not from Darnell, not from herself. The lies she had told in order to keep their life together were suffocating her, and it seemed as though their relationship, once so full of promise, was spiraling toward an irreparable end. The mounting pressure of secrets and the constant fear that Darnell might eventually find out the truth pushed Shanice to a breaking point. One fateful evening, after another devastating gambling loss that left their finances in shambles, Shanice knew that she could no longer live with the weight of her lies. She had to tell him everything, even if it meant destroying the last remnants of their marriage. With her heart pounding in her chest, Shanice sat Darnell down that night, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts of how he would react, what he would say, and whether he would ever look at her the same way again. She told him everything. The truth about the debts, the high-end escorting, the choices she had made out of desperation to save them both. Her voice cracked as she spoke, her emotions raw and tangled. The silence between them was suffocating, and Shanice felt as though her confession had torn down the last wall of security they had built together. But she held on to a fragile hope, that by being honest, they could rebuild. Maybe, just maybe, they could start over. But Darnell's reaction was nothing like what Shanice had imagined. The anger that flashed in his eyes was immediate, as if her words had cut him deeply. His face turned crimson, and before she could explain further, Darnell was on his feet, pacing back and forth in a frenzy. He lashed out, accusing Shanice of the ultimate betrayal. To him, her actions were an unforgivable violation of their marriage, a betrayal so deep that it shattered the foundation of everything they had built together. He demanded to know how she could keep such a thing from him, how she could lie and deceive him while he was already fighting his own demons. In the eyes of a man already consumed by his addiction, Shanice's secret life felt like the ultimate act of treason. Darnell's anger quickly spiraled out of control. His insecurities, long buried under layers of charm and bravado, rose to the surface in an explosion of rage. He accused Shanice of not loving him enough to be honest, of sacrificing their marriage for money and selfish gain. The resentment he had been quietly harboring, the frustration over his own failures, and the jealousy of her secret life all collided in a vicious outburst. The words between them were harsh and cutting, each accusation fueling the other's emotional fury. Shanice tried desperately to explain, to tell him that she had done what she thought was necessary to protect their future, that it was all for him, because she loved him so much. But Darnell was beyond listening. The anger clouded his judgment, and his pain manifested itself in violent outbursts that left Shanice trembling, caught in a whirlwind of words that seemed to cut deeper than any physical blow. The argument became a blur of shouting and blaming, with no resolution in sight. As the conversation escalated, so did Darnell's fury. His jealousy consumed him, and his fear of losing Shanice only amplified his rage. He couldn't understand how she could do this to him, couldn't fathom how her love for him had allowed her to make such a choice. Shanice's pleading fell on deaf ears, as Darnell spiraled further into his anger, unable to comprehend the weight of her actions in a way that allowed him to process it calmly. In that heated moment, Darnell's words were like daggers. He felt betrayed not just by Shanice's secret life, but by the idea that the woman he loved and trusted had kept something so monumental from him for so long. His mind raced, unable to reconcile the image of the woman he adored with the reality of her actions. The jealousy he felt wasn't just about the men Shanice had been with, it was about losing control, about the fragile grip he had on their relationship being wrenched away by the very woman who was supposed to stand by him. The violence in Darnell's voice was palpable, and Shanice found herself recoiling from him, her heart breaking as she realized how much the truth had broken him. She begged him to understand, to see the desperation she had felt, but the anger in his eyes told her that nothing she said could make him see past the betrayal. He was too consumed by the weight of his own insecurities and the fear of losing her. What had started as an attempt to salvage their relationship had instead ignited the most violent and destructive confrontation they had ever faced. Shanice's worst fears were realized in that moment. Darnell was no longer the man she had married. He was a stranger, a man lost in his own rage, unable to process the magnitude of her actions. She had hoped for understanding, for a chance to work through their issues together, but now all she could do was watch as their world collapsed around them. The love they had shared seemed to dissolve in an instant, replaced by a toxic mix of anger, jealousy, and broken trust. The future she had dreamed of with him seemed impossible now, as she was caught in the aftermath of her confession, her one final attempt to save them both, now fueling the fire that threatened to consume everything. The argument between Darnell and Shanice reached a fever pitch, each harsh word further fueling the destructive spiral. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of betrayal, anger, and pain that seemed to overwhelm any sense of reason. Darnell, his mind clouded by rage and the overwhelming burden of his addiction, could no longer contain the destructive emotions that were ripping through him. He had always been able to mask his insecurities, to charm his way out of trouble, but tonight, there was no escape. The truth, the weight of Shanice's confession, had shattered him. Everything he thought he knew about her, about their life together, had been ripped apart in one devastating moment. In the heat of their argument, Darnell's hand flew to the nearby kitchen counter, his fingers gripping the closest object within reach. The cool steel of a kitchen knife, once a tool for cooking, now became the instrument of unimaginable violence. Shanice, her eyes wide with fear, had tried to back away, but her attempts to calm him, to plead with him to understand, only seemed to stoke the fire of his fury. The words they exchanged, once full of love and promise, now turned into a vicious, violent exchange that could not be undone. Darnell, consumed by the feeling of betrayal, lashed out. His hand raised the knife, and in that moment, there was no room for rational thought, just a searing desire to punish her for the pain he felt. Shanice's scream filled the room, a chilling sound that echoed through the house, but Darnell was beyond hearing. The knife came down repeatedly, the impact of each blow driven by a mixture of anger, jealousy, and despair. The room was soon filled with the sickening sound of metal slicing through flesh and the rush of blood spilling onto the floor. With each stab, Darnell's anger intensified, as though the violence was the only way to rid himself of the chaos inside. 27 times, the knife pierced her body, each wound a violent, furious exclamation of his pain and disbelief. The physical act of violence, the sheer brutality of it, was a manifestation of the rage and helplessness that had been building inside him for so long. He wanted to hurt her, wanted to make her feel the betrayal he felt, but in that moment, as Shanice's body went limp, he was confronted with the reality of what he had done. The woman he once loved, the woman who had shared his life, lay lifeless on the floor before him, the room now stained with her blood. The silence that followed was deafening. Darnell stood frozen, the knife still in his hand, his body drenched in her blood. His chest heaved with each ragged breath, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. In his fit of rage, he had destroyed the very thing he had once held dear, his marriage, his love, his future, all gone in an instant. The weight of his actions settled like a crushing burden, but there was no time for reflection, no space to process the depth of his regret. Shanice was gone, and nothing could bring her back. Darnell's body trembled, the reality of the murder slowly sinking in. The shock of what he had done paralyzed him, leaving him motionless in the center of the room, his mind a haze of guilt, fear, and disbelief. He had never imagined it would come to this. He hadn't planned for it, hadn't even considered the possibility of such violence, but now, in the aftermath, he was trapped in the very nightmare he had created. For a moment, Darnell did not move. He didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to make sense of the destruction he had wrought. The horror of the situation was too much for his mind to process. He never considered fleeing, there was no escape from the reality of what he had just done. The knife, still gripped tightly in his hand, felt like a foreign object, something that had no place in this home, in this life. His world had shattered, and he was left standing in the wreckage, unable to make sense of it. The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of footsteps from outside the house. Neighbors, who had heard the commotion, the shouting, the crashing, the desperate cries, had called the authorities. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the night, as they approached the house. Within moments, police arrived on the scene, rushing into the house to find Darnell still standing there, staring at the lifeless body of Shanice. The blood that covered him, the blood that stained the walls, was undeniable proof of what had happened. There was no attempt to flee, no effort to deny what he had done. He was paralyzed by his own guilt and fear, his actions having led to this irreversible tragedy. The officers quickly subdued him, but Darnell didn't fight back. There was no resistance, no desire to escape. He knew what he had done, and the weight of that knowledge crushed him from the inside out. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he allowed himself to be led away. The reality of his crime, the magnitude of the violence he had committed, hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Darnell Thompson had just destroyed everything he had ever loved, and in that moment, he knew there would be no coming back from it. The man he had been, the man he had hoped to be, was gone forever. The life he had once shared with Shanice was nothing more than a painful memory, a shattered illusion of love and trust. The police took him into custody without incident, and as he was led away, the only thing left behind was the quiet, bloody aftermath of a love turned deadly. The discovery of Shanice's brutal murder rocked the community, sending shockwaves through their upscale Las Vegas neighborhood. The aftermath of a violent attack that left no room for doubt. The sheer brutality of the crime was staggering, and the police immediately began their investigation, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. News of the murder spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for social media to pick up the story, with tributes pouring in from Shanice's fans, friends, and acquaintances. They mourned her loss, remembering her for her beauty, intelligence, and the perfect life she had appeared to lead. Her glamorous posts and charming smile had captivated thousands, leaving people heartbroken over the loss of a woman they had admired from afar. But as the details of the crime began to emerge, so too did whispers of a darker side to Shanice's life. The facade of perfection began to crack. As police dug deeper into the couple's life, they uncovered the shocking truth: Shanice had been living a secret double life as a high-end call girl, servicing wealthy clients to keep their financial struggles at bay. It was a revelation that stunned her friends, family, and followers alike. Those who had seen Shanice as a picture-perfect wife and mother now faced the reality of her hidden world, a world she had carefully kept from her husband and the public eye. The investigation quickly traced her last few interactions to a series of influential and powerful clients, their names now linked to the scandal that had torn apart her marriage and ultimately led to her death. Darnell's gambling addiction, a quiet but steadily growing problem, was also soon exposed. Investigators uncovered a web of debts, loans, and desperation that had put both Darnell and Shanice in an untenable position. His addiction had worsened over time, with losses mounting and no clear way out. His behavior had grown increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to the murder, his outbursts and explosive temper becoming more frequent. Friends and family of Darnell, those closest to him, described a man who had become consumed by his addiction, a man who no longer resembled the charming, charismatic figure he had once been. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the tragic events of that night were not an isolated incident but the culmination of a series of poor choices, secrets, and buried emotions. The case quickly became a media sensation, with news outlets reporting every new development. But it wasn't just about the crime, it was about what the crime revealed. The public was divided in their reaction, and social media exploded with opinions, accusations, and debates. Some saw Darnell as a victim of his addiction, a man who had spiraled out of control due to forces beyond his understanding. They argued that his gambling problems and the crushing pressure of his mounting debts had driven him to a breaking point. They questioned whether anyone, given the same circumstances, could have held it together. Others, however, were less sympathetic, pointing to the violent nature of the crime as proof of a man consumed by rage and jealousy, someone who allowed his emotions to completely overtake him. Public opinion was sharply divided. Many people sympathized with Shanice, a woman caught in a desperate situation, trying to save her marriage while living with a terrible secret. They felt her pain, her struggle, and her desire to protect Darnell from the reality of their financial situation. Others argued that her actions, though desperate, did not justify the violence that followed. Her decision to keep such a secret from Darnell only fueled the argument that the breakdown of their relationship was inevitable. But regardless of where the public stood, the tragic truth remained. Shanice was dead, and the man responsible was Darnell Thompson, a man whose addiction and violence had destroyed everything he once loved. As the investigation continued and details of Darnell's violent outbursts and gambling problems emerged, the public was left to grapple with the complex nature of the crime. It wasn't just a case of one man murdering his wife, it was a case of addiction, secrecy, and the destructive power of lies. The media firestorm raged on, with the public desperate for answers, trying to make sense of the horrific events that had unfolded behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect marriage. Darnell's fate now seemed sealed, and yet, the debate continued. Could his addiction have been treated? Could Shanice have found a way to come clean before the tension between them exploded into violence? The questions surrounding their tragic ending continued to haunt the public, offering no easy answers, only the painful truth that in a world filled with secrets, the consequences could be deadly. The trial of Darnell Thompson was one of the most highly publicized events in Las Vegas that year. As the news of Shanice's murder spread, the public's appetite for answers grew, and the courtroom became a battleground for the truth. From the moment Darnell was arrested at the scene of the crime, it was clear that the case would be no ordinary trial. The defense and prosecution were locked in a fierce battle, with each side presenting a starkly different view of the man who had once been a rising star in the world of high-stakes gambling. Darnell's defense team argued that he was not in control of his actions when he killed Shanice. They painted a picture of a man emotionally destabilized by the crushing guilt of his secret addiction, his mounting debts, and the sense of betrayal he felt after Shanice revealed her double life. They insisted that the murder was a crime of passion, driven by overwhelming emotions in a moment of intense psychological distress. They highlighted his years of struggle with gambling, suggesting that his addiction had clouded his judgment and made him incapable of seeing the full consequences of his actions. On the other side, the prosecution was determined to make it clear that Darnell's violence was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a result of his long-standing history of aggressive outbursts and control over Shanice. They argued that Darnell's addiction had been a symptom of a much deeper issue, his inability to cope with failure, rejection, and the pressures of living a life that was increasingly out of his control. The prosecution presented graphic evidence of Shanice's brutal murder, the 27 stab wounds, each one a violent expression of Darnell's rage, and the blood-stained room where her final moments unfolded. They also highlighted the desperation in Shanice's attempts to defend herself, showing that she had fought valiantly against the man who had once promised to protect her. The jury was left to decide whether Darnell's actions had been driven by his addiction and emotional turmoil, or whether he had crossed a line into premeditated violence. The graphic nature of the crime weighed heavily on the jury, and as they deliberated, the courtroom held its breath. Would Darnell be shown leniency due to his struggles, or would justice be served for Shanice and the life she had lost? After a tense and emotional trial that lasted weeks, the jury returned with their verdict: Darnell Thompson was found guilty of first-degree murder. The room fell silent as the judge prepared to issue the sentence. As the judge read the ruling, Darnell's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a harsh sentence that reflected the severity of his crime and the irrevocable damage he had caused. In his final statement, the judge did not mince words. He condemned Darnell for the brutal act of violence that had taken Shanice's life and for the ripple effect of pain and suffering that followed. The judge spoke of the shattered lives of Shanice's family, friends, and the community, who had all been deceived by the couple's image of perfection. He made it clear that while addiction might have been a factor in Darnell's behavior, it could not excuse the murder of an innocent woman. Shanice's death was a direct result of Darnell's inability to process his emotions and the toxic combination of addiction, jealousy, and control. In the aftermath of the trial, the case became a focal point for discussions about the dangers of unchecked addiction, the pressure to live up to idealized images of love and success, and the toxic consequences of keeping secrets. Shanice's death raised important questions about the lengths people are willing to go to in order to maintain a perfect image, and the devastating consequences of living a lie. Could Darnell have been saved? Could Shanice have found a way out of her double life? These questions lingered, unanswered, as the world moved on, but the pain of their loss remained. This case is a haunting reminder of how addiction, secrets, and the weight of societal expectations can drive a person to commit the unthinkable. Darnell and Shanice's story serves as a tragic example of the devastating consequences when love is overshadowed by lies and fear. The facade of a perfect life was eventually shattered, exposing the brutal reality that, in a world where addiction and deceit fester, no one is immune to the consequences. As we reflect on their story, one question looms: could Darnell have saved his marriage if he had faced the truth sooner? Was there a chance for redemption, or was the cycle of addiction and secrecy destined to destroy everything in its path? And perhaps, more importantly, how can society create a space where individuals struggling with addiction and hidden secrets can seek help and support without fear of judgment or shame? If this story left you shaken, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more chilling tales that explore the darkest sides of love, betrayal, and tragedy.